the fourth and final part in topic 7 and 8, right? So make sure you watch from part 1, where we talked about the temporal bone, part 2 and part 3, we talked about the other bones, zygomatic bone, maxilla, and other facial bones, right? So in this video, we're going to talk about the vomer, the mandible, and the hyoid bone, right? So this is the vomer, right? So, okay, in the horse cow, you can see in the midline, on the upper part, there is perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone here, and below it in yellow, that's where you can find the vomer, right? The Latin name is vomer, okay? And you can also see it here, right, in the parasagittal plane. You can see it in green. That's the vomer, right? So the vomer, you can see, is only one, right? It's an unpaired bone. The vomer forms the posterior part of the bony nasal septum. Its superior border is split into two wings, ale femoris, which fits over the rostrum of the sphenoid bone, right? If you remember the rostrum of the sphenoid bone, right? So in between the wings, there is a space there for fitting the rostrum. The upper half of the anterior edge articulates with the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, and the lower part articulates with the cartilaginous part of the nasal septum. The inferior edge articulates with the nasal crest of the maxilla and palatine bone. The free posterior edge is the posterior border of the bony nasal septum. It separates the posterior openings of the nasal cavity, the hyoid, by means of which the nasal cavity communicates with the nasopharynx, right? Okay, let me show you the vomer one more time, right? So you can see here, here is the vomer, right? This is the vomer. You can see it articulating with the ethmoid bone. This is the cartilaginous part of the nasal septum, and you can also see it articulating with the maxilla and the palatine, right? And here, that's where the ethmoidal rostrum is, right? So the small wings will split, right? The ale femoris, and in between, the rostrum will get in, all right? Here is another view, right? Sulcus femoris, and you have the ala, the ale femoris. These two, you can see ale femoris, right? Okay, so that's the vomer, right? Then the next bone is very important. That's the mandible, right? So you can see the mandible indicated in green, right? So the mandible, Latin name is mandibula, is the skeleton of the lower jaw and the inferior part of the face. This bone is mobile and largest and the strongest facial bone because its function is concerned with mastication, chewing, right? The size and shape of the mandible and the number of teeth it bears, it changes with age, right? In newborn, the mandible consists of two halves united in the median plane by a fibrous tissue joint called the mandibular symphysis menti. The two halves of the mandible begin to fuse during the first year and are completely fused in the second year of life. Right, so parts of the mandible. The mandible is two main important parts. The body of the mandible, corpus mandibulae, which is the horizontal part and carries the teeth, right? So this is the body of the mandible, like the one which is not indicated in green. In green, these are two rami, right? Rami mandibulae. They are vertical parts which serves for the formation of the temporomandibular joint and for attachment of muscles of mastication, right? The body and rami meet posteriorly at the angle of the mandible called angulus mandibulae, right? On the angle, you can see right? Exactly here. That's the angle. That's the angle. On this side, I can't show you because my indicator is not going down further, right? But this is the angle, angulus mandibulae, right? There are important things which you need to remember about like this lower part, right? On the outside, there is a place for attachment of the masseter, right? Masseter is a very important muscle of mastication. It's called masseteric tuberosity. The masseteric tuberosity is here. Tuberositas masseterica. And in the inner surface, there is attachment for the middle pterygoid, is another important muscle of mastication, right? So this tuberosity is called what? The pterygoid tuberosity. Tuberositas pterygoidea. Tuberositas pterygoidea. All right. So those are the two parts, the body and the ramming, right? So let's have a closer look on the body, corpus mandibulae, right? The structure and relief of the body of the mandible are determined by the teeth. Of course, we talked about this. The body has two parts: the alveolar part of the body, pars alveolaris, which is the upper part, and the base of the mandible, basis mandibulae, which is the rounded, massive, and thick inferior border of the body. Right. Okay, let's look here. What do we have? We have the alveolar part, which is upper here, the alveolar. The superior border of the alveolar part from the alveolar arch, arcus alveolaris. Arcus alveolaris. Right. Remember, which other bone has arcus alveolaris? Yes, it's the maxilla. Right. It carries the dental sockets, alveoli dentalis, for 8 lower teeth. The sockets are separated by the interalveolar septa interalveolaria, and a series of depressions in between the ridges of the tooth roots are seen on the external surface of the alveolar part. I will show you another picture where you can actually see them. And these ridges are called the alveolar yolks, Yuga alveolaria, right? Yuga alveolaria. So that's all about the alveolar part, right? Next, there is a base of the mandible, basis mandibulae, and it has two surfaces, external surface and the internal surface, right? So starting with the external surface, the mandibular symphysis menti, is evident on the adult skull as a bone ridge in the midline of the body called the mental protuberance, right? Protuberantia mentalis. On each side of this protuberance, there is mental tubercle, tuberculum mentale. I will show you. And also there is, inferior to the second molar tooth, on each side, there is mental foramen, foramen mentale. And there will be an oblique line, linea obliqua, which runs to the back and upwards on each side of the mental tubercle. Right. Okay, so let me show you these things, right? The firstly, symphysis menti. Symphysis menti is not labeled here, but it's here in the midline, right? That's where it will be located. And then next there is protuberance, right? So it's what? Protuberantia mentalis here, the mental protuberance. And on the side, on each side, there is mental tubercle, tuberculum mentale. Here is one, tuberculum mentale. And from this going back, there is a line called what? Oblique line, linea obliqua. So the next part will be the internal surface, of course, because I just talked about the external surface. Right. So in the internal surface, there is firstly the mental spine, spina mentalis, which projects from the inner surface at the site of the mandibular symphysis. Right. So this spine, this mental spine, is very important because it's for attachment of the genioglossus muscle. It's a muscle for the tongue, genioglossus, right? There is also the digastric fossa, fossa digastrica on both sides of the mandible spine, right? And it's for attachment for the gastric muscle. There is myelohyoid line, right? Linear myelohyoid, right? And this is important for the myelohyoid muscle. There is mandibular fovea mandibularis for the submandibular salivary gland, and the fovea sublingualis for the sublingual salivary gland. Fovea mandibularis is for the mandibular salivary gland, and then fovea sublingualis is for the sublingual salivary gland, right? Right, so look here, mental spine, spina mentalis here for the attachment of genioglossus, right? So on the either sides, on both sides, I told you there is what? Fossa digastrica, digastric fossa for the what? For the digastric muscle on the sides. And then the next will be the myelohyoid line, linear myelohyoid, right? Myelohyoid, right? For the what? For the myelohyoid muscle. And then there is a fovea submandibularis. Fovea submandibularis is here, and this is where the submandibular salivary gland lodges in, right? Okay, and the what else? Fovea sublingualis for the sublingual salivary gland is here, right? Okay, yeah, and we can also see the angle here. Yeah, that's all about because we are still talking about what the body, right? The base of the mandible. Right. Next, there is the ramus. All right. Ramus, I told you, this is the ramus, right? This vertical, right? And they have an internal surface and the external surface. External surface, not so much important things, but the internal surface is very important. Because on the internal surface, you find the mandibular foramen mandibulare. All right. So it's present on the internal surface of the ramus. It is the large oblong entrance into the mandibular canal, canalis mandibulae, transmitting a nerve and vessel to the lower teeth, right? So they have the alveolar nerves, the inferior alveolar nerves and vessels. The branches of these nerves and vessels emerge from the mandibular canal at the foramen mentale, mental foramen. The median edge of this foramen projects as a small tongue-like process called the lingula of the mandible. That's lingula, mandibule. Right, so this lingula, it actually gives the attachment to the sphenomandibular ligament. Right, there is also a myelohyoid groove, sulcus myelohyoideus. It originates behind the lingula and it runs downwards and forward. This groove lodges the myelohyoid nerve and vessels. There is also the buccinator crest, cresta buccinatoria, right? So this crest runs on the inner surface of the ramus upwards and from the last molars towards the coronoid process. And this crest is for attachment for the buccinator muscle. Buccinator crest, buccinator muscles. All right, let me show you these things. Right, so this is the inner surface. Right, that's the inner surface of the ramus. So mandibular foramen, you can see it here. So if you want to inject an anesthesia, that's the point of entrance. And I told you there is a lingula, right, for the sphenomandibular ligament, lingula mandibule, right? And sulcus myelohyoideus, sulcus myelohyoideus. I told you this is important for myelohyoid nerves and vessel, right? Okay. Another prominent feature of the ramus mandibulae are these two processes. Processus coronoideus, which you find anteriorly, and processus condylaris, the condylar process, which you find posteriorly, right? And in between these two processes, there is a notch, the mandibular notch, incisura mandibulae, right? The condylar process has a caput mandibulae, the head of the mandible, which articulates with the mandibular fossa on the temporal bone, forming the temporomandibular joint. You can also see the neck here, the neck of the mandible, column mandibulae here. What else? I think that's all about the mandible, right? So you need to go to school, find the bone, and look at these important features. Last bone considered as part of the viscerocranium is the hyoid bone, right? So the hyoid bone is actually found between the chin and the thyroid cartilage of the larynx at the level of third cervical vertebra, C3. It is suspended in this position by muscles and ligaments, right? So it doesn't articulate with any other bone. So this bone, I told you, it belongs to the visceral cranium, and it looks like an arch. It has three important things, right? The body, this is the body in the middle part, the corpus, and then two greater wings and two lesser wings, right? Two greater wings are conua majora, and two lesser wings here, conua minora, right? Thank you so much. Thank you for sticking around, right? So that's the end of the topic 7 and 8. Until next time, please make sure you share with other students, right? So before going to class, watch the video and then study and then get a piat. A piat is 5 in Ukrainian.